Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us here today. If you're able to hear me, please give me a quick wave. All right, good. Wanted to make sure we had everything going. Doing it a little bit different today. I'm going to be handling the tech part of this as well as hosting this because we have a lot of things going on at Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center right now. I'm going to continue to let folks into the room. All of your lines are muted. I think you should be able to unmute them yourselves, but try to keep them muted until we get to a point where we have an opportunity for questions. We'll do as we've done in the past. You can indicate in the chat if you have a question that you'd like to ask any of us. We have a little bit smaller group today. We kind of intended that from the beginning. We wanted to get a number of key leaders here to talk about this really important topic today. This is Jeff Garis. I'm with the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. I'm the Outreach Director, and I coordinate our federal issues campaign, the 99% Pennsylvania. Really glad that you're here to join us today. It's been exactly 5 weeks since our last 99% Pennsylvania Zoom meeting, and in many ways, a lot has happened since then, a lot has changed since then, and unfortunately, in some very negative ways for people in Pennsylvania, things have not actually changed all that much. I'm going to start off by giving a little bit of the political context of where we are with this effort to have the kind of robust and comprehensive federal relief package that Pennsylvania needs, a little bit about kind of where we are in this effort, where we've gotten to, and then talk a bit about why the stakes are so high right now and why there's a real need for some rapid response activities, some real advocacy in a public way over the next month. Marc Stier is going to talk as well. He's the Director of Pennsylvania Budget and Policy. He'll talk a bit about, kind of where things stand in the state of Pennsylvania, some of the challenges that people are facing, some of the challenges that our state government is facing, how those challenges might be able to be resolved, and kind of a bit about what some of our options are at this point. I'm going to switch the screen here. For some reason, my screen view doesn't seem to be showing up correctly. Anyway, we'll also then talk specifically about some of the advocacy efforts that we at Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center and the 99% Pennsylvania campaign are undertaking, some resources that we have to share with you, some opportunities for you and organizations that you work with to join us in these important advocacy efforts over the next month to secure the kind of robust and comprehensive federal relief that Pennsylvania needs right now and will need for the next few months as we continue to deal with this unprecedented coronavirus pandemic. Again, thank you all for joining us. So where are we? Where have we been? Where are we now? And what's coming up in the days and weeks ahead? The pandemic really kind of got underway, and really the point that we started to see, the kind of changes that we now have in place in Pennsylvania was pretty early in March. About the first or second week of March was when a lot of the protections started to go into place. Within the first few weeks, there were several federal relief efforts that were enacted. There was the CARES Act was one in particular that provided a lot of important protections for people in Pennsylvania and across the country. But most of those took place really within the first 2 months of the pandemic. As we started to get into May, particularly a lot of Democratic leaders at the federal level began to talk about, sort of a next phase of relief that needed to be put into place to deal with some of the long-term problems that were there. The initial relief efforts and packages that were put into place, particularly the CARES Act, were very specific that the funding that was going to state governments and local governments could only be used for new coronavirus-related programs. In fact, it was pretty specific that that money coming into Pennsylvania could not be used for backfilling lost revenue. And we've seen a lot of revenue losses, some sharp declines in revenue that we're likely to see continue for the next year. This year's budget probably will see about $6 billion or more in lost revenue. And this is very difficult to make up without massive cuts to programs, to staffing, to important services for Pennsylvania. You know, there was this need for additional aid to state and local governments. There was a need to continue some of the protections that had been put into place, things related to enhanced unemployment assistance of $600 per week, pandemic-related unemployment that would apply for people who were not traditionally eligible for unemployment, gig workers, contractors, self-employed individuals. There was also a moratorium on evictions, on some specific federal-related rental issues that was put into place. But the unemployment assistance and the moratorium on evictions both were set to expire at the end of July. So Democratic leaders in the House began in May to move forward with a comprehensive relief package that would provide additional assistance to state and local governments to help offset lost revenue, that would continue the protections that were in place related to housing and unemployment, and that would also help in some new ways, providing an increase in SNAP benefits for the increasing number of people who were struggling with food assistance in Pennsylvania and across the country. So the U.S. House of Representatives passed about the middle of May what they called the HEROES Act. It was an acronym. I'll be honest, I haven't memorized what all the letters stand for, but you know, everyone knows what we're talking about with the HEROES Act. It was a slightly more than $3 trillion package, kind of unprecedented in scope because we're dealing with an unprecedented crisis that has so many implications, both short-term and long-term for so many of us. The HEROES Act, again, was slightly over $3 trillion. It was passed in a vote in the middle of May. Immediately, Republican leaders in the U.S. Senate and in the administration indicated that they were not going to go along with a package of this size. They talked about something maybe a third the size or even smaller than that. But then the Senate did nothing. McConnell did nothing for 2 months to move forward in any kind of way, making it difficult to begin negotiations. You know, we knew clearly where the House stood and where Democratic leaders stood, what their starting point was, and you know, it was really on the Senate and the Republicans to make clear where their starting point was. It wasn't until the Senate came back from a lengthy recess in July, from the 4th of July on, until about the final week and a half of July, shortly before the moratorium on evictions would expire, shortly before the enhanced unemployment benefits would expire. McConnell brought them back to session, and for several days there wasn't really any announcement exactly of what he was going to move, but he finally came out with what they called the HEALS Act. Heroes versus HEALS, I got to be honest with you, they spelled HEALS H-E-A-L-S, but when you say we're talking about the difference between heroes and heels, probably not good messaging on their part. But the HEALS Act that McConnell proposed was only $1 trillion in size. It did not provide any assistance for state and local governments. It would have cut the enhanced unemployment assistance from $600 a week down to $200 a week, putting into place something even more challenging, telling state governments that they had to limit people's unemployment assistance to not more than 70% of what they were earning prior to the pandemic. Of course, you know, with independent, self-employed gig workers, that would have been challenging. And simply the sheer volume of people in need of employment assistance meant that, you know, even trying to do 70%, trying to calculate nickel and dime this was going to be very time consuming and difficult for the state unemployment systems. The package also included something that McConnell specifically wanted, which was a shield against lawsuits for liability for businesses that did not take proper precautions for protecting their employees and their customers from contracting the coronavirus. That was something that McConnell made clear from the beginning. But it became clear very quickly when he announced the HEALS Act that he did not have his caucus behind him on this. In fact, it became clear over the next few days after he announced the HEALS Act that probably close to half of the Republicans in the U.S. Senate did not support even a $1 trillion relief package like McConnell had proposed. Some of them, some of the really hardcore, extreme folks in the Senate indicated that they didn't want to provide any more assistance. And many of them indicated they certainly didn't want to provide assistance to state and local governments. So, you know, that HEALS Act didn't even begin to move in the Senate, and McConnell's inability to get his caucus behind it kind of pushed him to the side. The Trump administration stepped in and began to negotiate directly with Pelosi and Schumer for some kind of relief package. But again, they were talking about something relatively the same size, about $1 trillion, a third the size of the HEROES Act. And again, that wouldn't provide any kind of aid to state and local governments. So, you know, they negotiated for a bit, but didn't make any progress. They broke off about the second week of August, and negotiations have really not resumed since then. Schumer and McConnell have indicated that they would meet the Republicans halfway. They would take $1 trillion off of the HEROES Act and meet somewhere kind of in the mid to low $2 trillion range. But again, Republican leaders and the Trump administration said they were not going to go for something of that size. In the last couple days, the Trump administration has indicated they might go up maybe 100 or 200 billion dollars in size, but really not much more above 1.2 trillion on this. Trump then put into place some executive orders to provide some form of unemployment assistance at a $300 per month level, requiring states to put in an extra $100 per month. This was totally separate funding coming out of FEMA. It's difficult for states to get this set up. There's a lot of changes they have to do in how they do this. And there are problems with it in that it's very short term. Just this week, earlier this week, there was an announcement that the CDC is putting into place a moratorium on evictions through the end of this calendar year. But again, this is short term. It doesn't deal with the fact that individuals who are months behind on their rent are not going to be able to catch up on that in the next 2 to 3 months. And, you know, we'll have an eviction crisis whenever this particular moratorium on evictions ends. So there is a real need right now for some kind of negotiated bipartisan, but very robust relief package to be moved forward. The Senate is coming back in next Tuesday. The rest of Congress is coming back in as well. They will be in for several weeks. The hope is that they can get something negotiated and put into place to provide the kind of relief that we need here in Pennsylvania and across the country. But McConnell has indicated earlier this week that instead of even voting on the HEALS Act, a $1 trillion short-term, not completely effective program, he wants to come back with something even smaller. And folks in DC are telling us this might be something maybe in the range of $500 billion. So coming back in and saying their starting point is going to be even smaller and more limited is obviously a deal breaker for the Democrats. There is concern that the fact that there is a need for a continuing resolution to fund the government by the end of September could mean that this could get rolled into that. It's a vote that's going to have to pass, or it will shut down the federal government a month and a half, 2 months before the elections. Nobody at the federal level wants to be responsible for a government shutdown. So there is some concern that, you know, we may see a very weak, insubstantial, ineffective relief might get put into the continuing resolution to fund the government at the end of September. So there are things that need to happen. The sense is that if we don't get a federal relief package passed by the end of this month, we will probably not see one before the end of this year. And that's going to be devastating for people across Pennsylvania. It's going to have huge implications for our state budget, which, as you recall, is a partial stopgap budget with most of the budget funded for only 5 months. I'm going to talk about what our advocacy efforts will be like, and what we think are the most important things to be doing in terms of advocacy over the next 3 to 4 weeks. But I'm going to turn it over to Marc Stier now to talk a bit about what some of the things are that are impacting Pennsylvania, why some of these executive orders and even the CDC moratorium on evictions are really just short-term Band-Aid approaches that are not the kind of relief that we need. So, Marc, you can go ahead and pull folks in on this.
Thanks, Jeff. Just covered a lot of elements of the problem we're facing in the state, so I'm not going to speak for too long. I just want to mention a couple of things. First of all, let me talk a little bit about the housing eviction crisis, since that's immediately in the news right now. As you know, Governor Wolf declined to extend the moratorium, saying he didn't have the legal basis to do that. The federal government, in the form of the CDC, has created a moratorium on evictions and foreclosures through the end of the year. We're still asking the General Assembly to take action to authorize Governor Wolf to do the same thing here, because we're expecting a legal challenge to the CDC's actions. The lawyers I've talked to think that it's pretty firmly based in the CDC's authority, but they're worried that if it goes to the wrong judges, there might be a halt to it or even an end to the program. At any rate, a moratorium just delays the larger problem. At some point, the moratorium comes to an end. People who haven't been paying rent in whole or in part will then face immediate eviction. And I just want to give you an idea of how great a problem that is. The census has been doing what they call the pulse survey, which looks at households and asks them about how they're dealing with the immediate problems of COVID-19. They've been surveying people through between May and the end of July. And in each of those, and it's a weekly survey, each of those weeks, on average, 20% of Pennsylvanians say they have not paid their rent or they're behind in their rent. Now, that 20% do that doesn't necessarily mean that only 20% of Pennsylvania households will face eviction, because we know some people pay rent when they can and some people don't when they can't. Our estimate is between 25 and 35% of households that rent will be behind on their rent whenever the moratorium ends. And that's about 350 to 621,000 households in the state. That's just a huge number. And since the average household has 2.48 people in it, we're talking about somewhere between 881,000 and 1.7 million people who might lose their homes in the aftermath of the ending of an eviction moratorium. So that's a very serious problem. The way to stave it off is ultimately to provide more rental assistance so that people can pay their rent and pay their mortgages. The state has created a program to do that. It has a lot of barriers for renters in terms of the information they need to acquire and in terms of the limits on rent that can be paid through the program. It's now capped at $750 a month and won't pay any more, and demands that landlords accept the $750 a month. And a lot of landlords are saying no, they won't accept that amount. So we're seeking efforts on part of the General Assembly to expand the amount and put more money into the program. It's now funded for $150 million. The governor asked for another $100 million. We think there's going to be even greater need. Now, ultimately, we're going to need the federal government to provide funding to continue this program. There's going to be a big backlog in unpaid rent. And because of that, there's going to be threats of people being evicted come the end of the year. Without federal aid, we're going to have serious problems. We're going to need federal aid to keep the expansion of the SNAP program going. We're going to need federal aid for the Medicaid program. I've just got some recent estimates about Medicaid usage, and it has been growing in the state. We have a temporary increase in the FMAP rate. That's the rate at which the federal government covers Medicaid costs, but that only goes through the end of December. After December, the rate returns to about 50% for traditional Medicaid. The state will need funding to keep the Medicaid program going. And ultimately, the state has to deal with a massive shortfall in revenues. We're talking about a $4 to $5 billion shortfall in revenues over a 2-year period, and since we basically got through last year with the and carried over the deficit to this year, that's $4 to $5 billion that the General Assembly has to fill, and that's in a state budget of about $35 billion. That's we're talking about a big chunk of the state budget, and the options for dealing with this revenue shortfall are all pretty bad. One is to cut the budget. And since the state funded education for the whole year, it's not clear that that can happen. They may, it's the General Assembly under the control of the Republicans may decide in November after the election, if they come back for a session, to seek to cut education funding. The governor could veto it. Beyond that, there's just not that much to cut. There are a lot of expenses the state carries that are mandated. They have to pay debt service. They have to pay pensions. They can't just let people out of prisons. Medicaid payments have to keep coming from the state, or we lose federal funding. There are a lot of other programs that if the state doesn't pay its share, we lose federal funding for them. So there's no easy way to cut a budget. They could do the worst you could imagine to human services, to disabilities, violence against women programs, mental health programs, and still only come up with $400 million or $500 million to cut. So cutting is difficult, and also it's just unconscionable, both because of the people who would get hurt, whether it's school children or people with mental health problems or people who suffer from intellectual disabilities, or because any cuts to the state budget will lead to laid off employees, both in the public and the nonprofit sector, and that will slow the economic recovery. The last thing we want to do is repeat the mistakes that Tom Corbett made during the Great Recession, which the massive cuts in education and other parts of the budget delayed the recovery in Pennsylvania substantially. It led to long-term slow jobless growth here. We do not want to do that again. So cutting is both very difficult and also a very bad idea. We could borrow money. That probably makes some sense. There are ways for the state to borrow money on various revenue sources. We did that a couple of years ago to get through a budget deficit. There's still tobacco revenues to borrow. We can borrow on Liquor Control Board revenues. We can borrow on any package of revenues that they could securitize. And while that may make sense in the short term, because this is a crisis like a war in which the burden should be spread out over a number of years and frankly over generations, not just be placed on people who are in Pennsylvania at this very moment. The long-term problem is if you borrow on state revenues, you're cutting revenues for the future. And as I think many of you know, we've had a state budget that's been tenuously balanced for 10 years. Every year, the budget is balanced with creative funding ideas, with one-year funds, with selling gambling licenses, with moving funds backwards forward from one year to another, with underestimating Medicaid caseloads, which is frankly an art form now in Pennsylvania budgeting. We have a tight budget already. And it's not just the budget that's tight, it's state spending that's tight. We are massively underinvesting in education and in higher education, in human services, in environmental protection, and frankly in infrastructure as well. Our roads and bridges are in a terrible state of repair. So we simply can't borrow without putting ourselves in an even deeper hole over the long term. That means we've got to raise revenues in the state. But raising revenues to close a $5 billion deficit is incredibly difficult. Even if we can get some money out of it. And that doesn't matter how the election turns out. If the Republicans win, we know they're reluctant to raise revenues. The Democrats are also going to be reluctant to raise revenues at the level we're talking, $4 or $5 billion. If they get the majority, having just been given a majority, they're not going to want to go to the public and say, we're going to raise your taxes at very high rates. So it comes down to we actually need this federal money if the state is going to continue to provide the services we all require, demand, need, without compromising the future of an already tenuously balanced state budget. So we desperately need federal support. Just for the state government, we need support for Medicaid. We need that FMAP increase to continue. We need money for housing. We need money for SNAP. Because without this money, Pennsylvanians are going to suffer, and the state government is actually going to be crippled. So it's a bleak picture. It's difficult to see, you know, if the elections results go the wrong way. I think we're looking at a total disaster. Even if they go the right way, we're looking at a period between November and when the federal government can act in the early part of 2021, where the state is going to be suffering, and we're going to have a period of time that's going to be very, very difficult to get through. So we need money from the federal government now, right now, and anything you can do to follow Jeff's directions and, you know, make your voices heard and lift up this issue will be really critical in ensuring that we at least get something from the federal government soon, so we can get through the end of this year and the beginning of 2021 without a real disaster. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Mark.
If there are questions,
yeah.
I can take some.
We do have a question from Diane. It's a question related to mortgages and folks who might be impacted by that. Diane, I've unmuted your line. You can ask the question directly.
Thank you, Jeff. So that was a very informative presentation, Mark, with some devastating numbers. I couldn't agree with you more that we need to have some kind of push for federal assistance for Pennsylvania. You threw out some numbers for renters, which kind of grabs your attention, because that then equates to millions of people who will be homeless. Are there also numbers for people who are behind in their mortgages and may lose their homes and also become homeless?
We're going to try to get those numbers. I do not have them at my hands right now. We've been, ever since this crisis was developing, been mostly focused on renters because they tend to be folks with lower incomes, and we want to address that first. I hope to have some information on people who are behind in their mortgages in the next couple of weeks.
Great.
And while we're talking about mortgages, can I just point out one thing that's really striking to me, and just as a sign of the terrible inequality in our society. If you've kept your job and you have a mortgage, most likely you've heard 10 times in the last 5 weeks from your mortgage company asking if you want to refinance. They won't leave me alone. And I borrowed for my house in Harrisburg pretty much at the bottom of the market. So people with means, people who own homes and have mortgages are now refinancing their homes and saving money. Saving some cases hundreds of dollars every single month. Yet while they're employed and they're still, employment for people with high wages is higher than it was in January right now in Pennsylvania. People who have mortgages and have kept their jobs and can keep paying them are saving money. So this is just a microcosm of the last 40 years of public policy in this country. The people who are doing well are doing better during COVID-19. The people who've been doing worse are really getting clobbered. And it's just utterly and totally shameful that this is where our country is at the moment.
Thanks for your question, Diane. We don't have any more questions in the queue right now. Sorry, I think we have one right now from Jeff asking about $4 to $5 billion in deficit for Pennsylvania over the next year. Pennsylvania Department of Revenue said revenues were up about 28.9 million over estimates for August 2020. Does that put us about 2.9 or $3 billion deficit, or do we have different numbers for where we currently are in Pennsylvania?
No, I mean, we brought in more money early in the early part of the summer because we had a delay in when tax payments were due. Remember, the state government followed the federal government delaying when you had to file your taxes from April to June. So revenues have been coming in better recently, over estimates, but the long-term picture is still bleak. I don't, you know, depending on who you ask in Harrisburg, the IFO thinks the deficit's about $4 billion. They haven't said anything recently that the recent revenue estimates gives them any reason to change that. The administration tends to think the deficit is a little bit higher. We're also facing a cash flow crisis. The treasurer's been talking about the fact that we're actually going to, state at some point is just going to run out of money to meet pay its bills towards the end of this year.
Thanks for the question, Jeff, and thanks for addressing that, Mark. We just had a question in there from Sharon, who was asking about what we can be doing right now to advocate for this, which is a perfect opportunity to segue to some things that we are doing at Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center in conjunction with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities and other national organizations. I'm going to be providing some links to some of these resources in the chat, but I'm going to bring up on a shared screen right now some slides, and you'll have to tell me if you can see these. Let me switch over to screen share here. I'm usually doing this for other people. I just realized now this is the first time that I am actually sharing my screen. So we'll go here, and are folks able to see this? Mark, do you see the slide?
Yes.
Okay. All right. And is that, okay, there we go, great. So here are some opportunities for coordinated advocacy for the kind of robust and comprehensive COVID relief package that we need to see here in Pennsylvania. We have a number of things that are ongoing actions. Again, you know, the timeline that we're getting from everyone at the national level is that really this month is crucial. If we don't see a COVID relief package by the end of September, we are not going to see one probably this calendar year. So there is a lot at stake, as Mark mentioned. One thing that is being talked about a lot is the need to keep this issue and the story in front of the public, and also to make clear why we don't have a COVID relief package in place already. So one of the ways that we want to try to do that is with submissions of letters to the editor. Earlier and throughout the summer, we had folks sending emails to our members of Congress, in particular sending emails to and contacting the office of Senator Toomey. Folks got some automated replies on that, but we think it's really important now that our elected officials are put on notice publicly and that people are aware that there is a real crisis that is brewing right now and that we need to have this COVID relief package passed. We're really trying to keep this focused very specifically on what the crucial issues are. What it comes down to basically is people needing assistance with food, people needing assistance with healthcare, talking about things like Medicaid and helping the state government for that, people needing access to housing and shelter, the potential problems of this eviction crisis that's brewing and the need for some kind of effort to help people with that, and also people just simply not having money because they don't have jobs. So really, food, housing, healthcare, money. That's what this is about, and that's what we're going to try to continue to indicate in these letters to the editor. I have on screen there a bit.ly link, and I will put this into the chat box before the call ends today, so you can copy that. We'll send out an email with the video to today's presentation and links to all of the materials that I'm sharing here. We just sent this out actually to the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center, We the People, and 99% Pennsylvania email lists. We're starting to get some responses, but what we'd really like to see is a lot of letters to the editor coming into newspapers as the Senate returns to session next Tuesday. We have some template letters that we have created at Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center. If folks go to that link, they can put in their name, zip code, and indicate if they're interested in submitting an LTE, and then we'll follow up with folks probably beginning tomorrow, giving you some draft LTEs, links to newspapers. We'll probably try to make sure that we are not having 2 or 3 people submitting the exact same letter to the editor to the same newspaper. That's why we're not just sending people a draft of an LTE, because we want to make sure that we're not duplicating these. So if folks go there, we'll send that. Certainly people can write their own. They can also adapt the draft letters to the editor that we have. Our communications team will be happy to work with anyone to help adapt an LTE. And if you're going to write one on your own and submit it, that's great. If you can let me know. We'd like to try to share these on our Facebook pages and on social media, get them out there in front of people, make sure that there's a lot of exposure and that people are paying attention to this. Also, those of you who are with organizations in particular, we would really like to see submissions of op-eds from community leaders. Folks in the Clear Coalition have been submitting these, and we're going to continue to put these out there for folks. We will be happy to help with drafting op-eds, helping you. We can, frankly, ghostwrite an op-ed if you'd like to, but contact me if you or your organization would be interested in submitting an op-ed. Obviously, the difference with that and the letter to the editor is letters to the editor, we're about 200 to 250 words. Op-eds tend to be closer to 700 words or so. So it provides an opportunity to go more in depth. If there are issues impacting the communities that you serve, that would be a perfect opportunity to draft an op-ed or have us work with you on that. In addition to those ongoing efforts that will be continuing over the next 2 to 3 weeks, there are some very time-sensitive actions, some specific dates and times for things that we will be doing really over the next week. And we'll keep you posted about other ones coming beyond that. But one is that there is a tweet storm that will be happening next Wednesday afternoon, starting at 1 p.m., Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and the Coalition on Human Needs, a number of other national organizations, folks who joined us on some of our Zoom calls over the summer are coordinating this. There is a box online of resources that are available for that tweet storm, draft tweets, hashtags, everything you need to know, graphics as well that you can use for that. Certainly we want to encourage folks to participate by retweeting, and I'll send out some reminders as we get close to next Wednesday. But I will again send the links in the chat box at the bottom before we wrap up, and we'll send out an email with that as well. But please mark your calendars for that tweet storm next Wednesday afternoon at 1. The day after that, there is going to be a virtual reality. I wish we were living in virtual reality. Believe me, I'd come up with one a lot better than where we are right now. A virtual rally next Thursday morning at 11 a.m. We're really grateful to folks at Shelley Lyons who are working with us in helping to bring this together. There is a link there where you can register and get the login to be present for that virtual rally. Man, I'm hung up on virtual reality today. We are going to be inviting Senators Casey and Toomey to participate, some of the key members of Congress, some of our state legislative leaders. We are also hoping to have people with personal stories who can share how they've been impacted by the pandemic, how some of these relief measures may have helped them, and the lack of continuing assistance is a real problem. Folks who maybe need additional assistance beyond what's already been put into place. So we really want to encourage folks to join us for that. If you know people, or if you have a personal story about how you've been impacted or people around you have been impacted, please get in contact with me directly, and we'll try to make sure that we give folks an opportunity to share their stories. We are inviting the news media to this. We'll be reaching out to the Pennsylvania Cable Network and other news outlets. And again, this is all about getting the story out there publicly, keeping people aware of what the situation is and how desperate the crisis is. Beyond the time-sensitive ones where we have a specific date, we're looking at some rapid response efforts. Because of the role that the Trump administration has in some of these ongoing negotiations, we want to particularly draw attention when the media is paying attention, and that's when Trump and Pence are coming to Pennsylvania to campaign. Our goal is to have some press conferences online, press conference calls the same day when we have a lot of national media in the state. We will be seeking people with personal stories, as well as community leaders, people who head up organizations like some of the groups that are on the phone today, who can speak to challenges that they're seeing in their region. Basically, we want to have kind of a roster of folks, and depending on which region in the state they may be visiting, where the media is that day, that will help us to, get in contact with folks who can share stories, who are willing to share stories as part of that. Just mentioning here, one thing that we're looking at doing, something we tried out with our We the People campaign last year, we're looking at the possibility of having a plane with a banner calling for federal aid and assistance to Pennsylvania that we would like to try to get flying around over the area when there are these visits with lots of national and even international news media following Trump and Pence as they go out and campaign. We think it's a good opportunity to get the message out there, and we're continuing to work on that, something we're kind of excited about. And yet again, another way to keep the public informed, to get this reported in the news media. We do have a number of advocacy resources that you can use in efforts that you undertake on your own, things you may want to do. You may want to host a press conference call yourselves for your organization with your local news media. There are a lot of resources here. I want to thank folks at Center on Budget and Policy Priorities for putting together this toolkit. There are sample letters to the editor, talking points, pitch notes to use to attract reporters, press advisories, and a whole resource library of just a lot of facts, figures, and information about what the impact has been of the pandemic on the country and on Pennsylvania specifically. Again, I've got the bit.ly link there, and I will be sharing these in the chat box here in just a second. So if you can help out in any way, certainly get in touch with me. You can use some of the online forms that we've set up already if you want to submit a letter to the editor, or register for next Thursday's virtual rally. But if you have other suggestions, ideas, things that you would like to do to volunteer, I want to invite you to get in contact with me, send me an email, give me a call. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here now so that I can switch over and put some of these items in the chat box now. See, we have a couple of comments folks have submitted in the chat box. Mark has indicated he has to run to another call. And some virtual meetings with members of Pennsylvania's congressional delegation. Groups have been having that. At least one member was directed back to one of those members of Congress to PA state agencies to utilize funds from the CARES Act. That's one of the things that some members of Congress have been saying is we're not going to give more money to the state government until the state government uses up and expends the CARES Act money that's already there. The problem with this is if it becomes clear that there's not going to be more relief coming to Pennsylvania, the way that CARES Act money gets allocated is going to be different than if we know that there's more money coming. You can't spend that CARES Act money until you know, is this all that there is, or will there be more? We think that's a bit of a red herring, and that the focus has to be on that what we have in the CARES Act is not going to be adequate to cover the problems that Pennsylvania faces. We need additional aid and assistance. I'm going to take this opportunity here as we're talking to put some of these things in to the chat box. I mentioned that we have these, switch it over to everyone, ongoing actions, the letters to the editor. There's a link for that there. And again, if you want to submit an op-ed, if your organization would like to do an op-ed, you can get in contact with me about that. But those are some of the ongoing efforts we'll be doing for the next 2 to 3 weeks. With regard to some of the time-sensitive actions, next Wednesday's tweet storm, there's a link there to a toolkit that CBPP has put together of sample tweets, resources, things to use, hashtags for the tweet storm. And also next Thursday's virtual rally, we have the link there for folks to register for that. Again, if you have a personal story or you know folks that you work with who would be willing to tell their story as part of that virtual rally, please get in contact with me. Talking about rapid response actions right there, these press conference calls that we want to do when the Trump-Pence campaign is in Pennsylvania, press conference calls. If you have speakers with personal stories or your organization would like to talk about the challenges that you're seeing, you can get in contact with me about that. And I noted earlier in my presentation the advocacy resources and the toolkit that we have available online. There's a link right there in the chat now for that relief advocacy toolkit. And finally, again, if you have ideas or questions, things that you want to try out, if you would like to have an op-ed with some assistance from the PBPC communications team, you can get in contact with me directly and I'll be glad to plug in. Again, the next 2 to 3 weeks especially are going to be very critical. We want to get this story out there publicly, letters to the editor, op-eds, press conference calls, tweet storms, all of the different tools that we're putting together and resources here. I'm going to stop and see if folks have any questions before we wrap up. I'm leaving that stuff up on screen if you want to copy that and paste that somewhere in a document. Again, we'll be sending out a link to the video of today's meeting along with all of these resources in an email tomorrow. But if you want to copy any of that, you can do so now. Any questions folks have before we wrap up? Okay, again, I want to thank you, and we have a very tough road ahead of us. There is a lot at stake, and what we do over the next 2 to 3 weeks can have a huge impact on what we see in terms of relief coming to Pennsylvania that our state government needs, that people who are facing dire circumstances right now especially need. So I want to thank you for anything and everything you're able to do. Have a great day. Look for an email from me tomorrow with links to all of these resources. Have a super afternoon. Bye.